For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates. This is StratNews Global. I am Amitabh Revi, and you're watching The Gist. Our expert today is a legend in the diplomatic world, Ambassador Thomas Pickering. He's been the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. That's the third senior most position in the U.S. State Department. He's been ambassador to India, Russia. He's been U.S.'s permanent representative and ambassador to the UN as well. Ambassador Pickering joins us from Virginia. Thank you so much for your time, Ambassador.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Ambassador, just wanted your reading of the situation in and around Ukraine. Where do you see this heading? Because there doesn't seem to be any de-escalation of sorts, though there have been many, many rounds with different parties involved who have been talking.
Mr. Revi, if you began by saying complex and confused, you would capture the situation as you've described it and as we now see it. But diplomacy always has its interesting and continuing undercurrents. And in the Ukraine question, there are three things that I think are defining now. One is Mr. Putin's fine balancing act between the combination of threats and assessments that in one way or another are intended to both lead people on in his favor and push the other side, the US and NATO. The second is the continuing uncertainties about what he is going to do. And the third is really the question of the ongoing Olympic Games and his interest in having a close relationship with the People's Republic of China in Beijing. And as a result, a sense now that we have a bit of a respite for diplomacy. The diplomacy is, of course, being conducted by many people in many ways. And to some extent, that confusion upsets an ability to understand whether there is now a useful track and a useful series of possible objectives and possible workouts. But we could talk about that later if that's of interest for you in your questioning.
Absolutely, Ambassador. I just want to play out a soundbite during the President Biden's meeting with the new German Chancellor, where he was asked a specific question on Nord Stream, because that is one of the threats that Vladimir Putin has hanging over him. This is what President Biden had to say.
If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine. Again, then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will. I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
Ambassador, that's what President Biden had to say. But how do you look at the whole Western alliance? I mean, the U.S., after President Biden said that the U.S. is back on the world stage, has reached out to whether it's NATO or EU in this context. NATO itself seems divided. You see Macron going to meet Putin. You have the German Chancellor at the White House. There were some reports suggesting that Macron could in effect, give Putin a veto over Ukraine and NATO. How do you see unity in the Western alliance?
There are a lot of questions there. Let me try to sort through them. I think the question of the alliance and the alliance's unity is central to this, because it is the major and most important pushback against the aggressive portions of what President Putin is presenting as the Russian position. And that's important because the alliance is own system the methods for reaching agreement. And agreement was not born with the birth of the alliance and become a continuing asset of the alliance forever with no hard work to put it in place. And so there is a diplomacy within the alliance that is very significant. And it takes place at the highest levels with the heads of state. It takes place in the North Atlantic Council in Brussels and so on. In any event, my sense is that the deeper the threats from Mr. Putin, the more likely there is to be solid agreement among the alliance as to how to deal with it. The second part of that question concerned how could President Biden deal with Nord Stream? Well, Nord Stream runs through the high seas seabed for a long period of distance in the Baltic. So one would know and understand that the portion that's under German control is within the German economic zone in the sea and with the German territorial waters. Hopefully, any action against Nord Stream because of the violence of the Russian action would secure Germany's support. And that was the hope yesterday. Chancellor Schmidt was helpful, but in my view, not conclusive in his support of Mr. Biden yesterday. But we will see, because they will continue to work on this. And one can imagine there will be a point beyond which German interest in a diplomatic answer fades away in response to the seriousness, the violence, and the use of force by Russia, which we, of course, hope never happens. Finally, there is throughout this whole particular enterprise, if I can call it this way, a firm adherence to the primacy of diplomacy. We have seen it from President Biden. We have seen it from President Putin. We have seen it from Chancellor Schmidt. We have seen it from President Macron and from others. And so on that basis, it's important to continue. Diplomacy doesn't happen overnight. It's not instant coffee. It takes a lot of hard work, a series of unfolding contexts, and the development of ideas that might help bridge the gap. One of those ideas is an idea that you've raised, that not all NATO members are yet ready to sponsor the expansion of NATO to Ukraine and Georgia. That might take a great deal of time, if at all. In any event, that means, in effect, that while NATO, and I believe this to be true, is not at all interested in taking a self-denying ordinance about expansion, the reality may well be that NATO expansion is not likely to happen because it requires unanimity of NATO members, something that is not present and which doesn't look like it will be present for some time. However, the more President Putin pushes the use of force and the buildup of his troops and equipment in and around Ukraine, the more likely it is to become that those states in the region, members of NATO, will feel the threat because it isn't limited only to Ukraine. What happens in Ukraine could have damaging effects elsewhere, and therefore NATO will come together much more in terms of its absolute requirement to defend all of its members if they are attacked either inadvertently, indirectly, or directly.
I'm just going to ask you what you think of India's position. Now, we made two statements from late January to last week. The major one came out at the UN Security Council, of course, but India, in the procedural vote for discussion on Ukraine, abstained along with Kenya and Gabon. But you have seen the Indian statement which talks about security concerns of all countries. How do you see India's statements vis-a-vis Ukraine, Ambassador?
Well, having served as ambassador for a time in the mid-90s in India, and understanding the history of Indian foreign relations and the strong affinity for India to the Bandung principles, non-alignment, and a deep sense of commitment to diplomacy, the statements made by the Indian representative to the United Nations, I think, characterize that smack on, and that's important. And I would think that President Biden should be grateful, even though India did not join in the Security Council resolution, they abstained, for the support for the diplomatic workout, which President Biden constantly repeats and reiterates as the centerpiece of the American approach to how to treat with the problem in Ukraine.
But Ambassador, if the situation gets worse, that is, if Russia does go across the Ukraine border again, apart from its gray warfare tactics, how do you see it impacting India-US relations, especially because we were looking at a possible CAATSA waiver for the S-400s? But if Russia takes an aggressive action in Europe, bipartisan support for that would also possibly be a problem.
Well, I think that you're pointing out a potential problem. I, of course, do not speak for the United States and cannot speak for the United States. And how the U.S. would treat with that problem would in very large measure depend upon what President Biden meant when he talked about tanks and foot soldiers crossing the Russia-Ukraine border, perhaps into the region now occupied by the two separatist oblasts and their Russian supporters. And so we have to wait and see what that means. I think President Biden is being extremely serious about the degree to which he has emphasized the significant importance of any use of force to deal with this problem on the Russian side. But he has also been very clear that he has no intention of sending US forces to Ukraine, but to the NATO allies in the region who have asked for additional forces from NATO, and where it is quite appropriate, given the threats to the region, that the US and the other NATO partners play a role in increasing their presence. But he has emphasized that that presence is a defensive presence and is there for the purpose of the alliance, which is defensive.
Sure, but I was talking about India-US relations because there'll obviously be a further hardening of stance in the US against Russia, which would mean that a subsequent policy initiative could be that anybody who's dealing with Russia would have problems. The S-400s, which face the CAATSA sanctions, could also have that.
That indeed might take place, although one would hope that there would be understanding in India that any unprovoked Russian use of military force, any unprovoked Russian aggression, would constitute a violation of Russia's obligations under the UN Charter, and indeed a violation of international law of the most extreme kind. And we have seen in the past the United Nations come together. They cannot do so in the Security Council as long as there is present there a Russian veto, but they might come together around other organizations and other approaches. We can only speculate. The US would, I think, strongly hope for both for Indian understanding and wherever possible, Indian support, particularly Indian support for a continued approach that used diplomatic settlement as the principal tool for resolving the problem. And we are not at the point, I believe, where the problem itself is ripe for any kind of military action. We have not exhausted all of the diplomatic endeavors. That will take quite a bit of time and quite a bit of effort. But what we are seeing now, obviously, of Russia's interest in using the military presence there as an effort to perhaps influence or leverage others in a direction that is favorable to Russia's approach, whatever that might be in the long run, will be something that clearly India and other countries in the region that have had traditionally strong relations with Russia will clearly want to take into account.
Ambassador, how do you view the analysis that says that the tension in Europe is actually pushing Moscow towards Beijing. And we saw Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin during the Beijing Olympics, a huge joint statement where Ukraine and Taiwan were also talked about. How do you see the Russia-China partnership developing while the US is in competition, in confrontation with Russia?
It's a very important question. And I think the Russia-China relationship extends back in history to the Second World War and before. So what's happening now, pushing Russia and China together, may well be a conclusion. On the other hand, it is very clear to me that Chinese interest in becoming involved in a war in Ukraine has to be quite limited by Chinese interest in producing around the world strong support for China, for economic development, for the Belt and Road proposal, for China's interest in becoming the world's leading or perhaps a leading economic player, and certainly in the whole question of multipolar solutions to world problems, not unipolar solutions to world problems, which is sort of where the Russians seem at the moment to be interested in taking us. And we have to be concerned about that. So the question here obviously is there a Russian-Chinese relationship that will overcome the differences? The differences begin perhaps about among the two, who is the leader? That was something that split Stalin and Chairman Mao years ago and led to violence on the Russia-China border in the mid-60s and led to a period of differences between Russia and China that hasn't been fully resolved. There are differences as well in terms of territorial questions that go back into the 17th, 18th, and 19th century in eastern Siberia, northeastern China. There are differences, obviously, between interdependence. How much should China become dependent or widely dependent on Russian oil and gas and Russian military supplies? And how should Russia parse that out, particularly on military supplies, where the tendency seems to have been that Russia will provide China with up-to-date military equipment, but perhaps not the most up-to-date military equipment, and where over a period of years, Russia's preoccupation with China and the China border has led Russia to insist that it must retain tactical nuclear weapons, and that a significant share of those seem to be oriented in their tactical configuration toward the Russian-China border, because Russia does not have manpower resources in Siberia sufficient to offset the very large Chinese population on the other side of the border in northeastern China.
Ambassador, how would you react to those analysts who say, because of the situation, whether it's America, whether it's other countries, you're looking at the Quad or AUKUS, are not being able to concentrate on what they should be, which is containing or constraining an aggressive China because of how Russia is dealing with the situation?
But I think that we have to deal with the world as it is, not as what we would wish it to be. I would think that any country that felt that China was a problem would wish it to be not a problem. And if it doesn't go away, not to have other competing problems to deal with. But the United States, I think, is a country of certain size, of dimensions, of facilities, of capabilities, of assets, of resources, and as a result, has to configure itself in a realistic way to deal with the world as it exists. And the US has been, I think, very interested in speaking with China on a regular basis, in seeing what it can do, both through a combination of economic pressure as well as openings for future cooperation with China that can, one way or another, begin to build a relationship which is neither all opposition, perhaps, or all in one way or another followership for China. Climate change is one of those areas where an effort to build a common relationship seemingly has taken a bit hold and has an important role. China and the United States share a common appreciation of energy needs and indeed the importance of energy and the need to, in one way or another, calculate how energy development is going to, over the future, affect things like climate change.
Ambassador Tom Pickering, absolutely appreciate your experience, your expertise, and your time. Thank you for giving us time on StratNews Global.
Thank you very much, Mr. Revi. It's always a pleasure to join you.
The pleasure was ours. And our viewers, keep the comments coming, as well as your feedback about this show and our other shows. To follow us on YouTube and subscribe to our channel. You can also follow our social media handles for all the latest news and analysis from an Indian perspective. This is The Gist on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.